Welcome to the Literati Scene with Smoki Bacon and Dick Concannon, and co-hosts Suzanne McDonald and Joanna DiTillo. So stay tuned. Our guest today is Howard Gardner. He is the Hub Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Educational School. He has just written a book, The App Generation, in which he's co-authored it with Katie Davis when in fact they were doing, Professor Katie Davis, when they were doing their research. Their research covered many areas of what is happening today with the app generation, and the areas were in fact affected by processive personalities and indeed relationships with other people. But you went into it deeper than that. You really strung it out through three areas. If you would walk us through for our viewers.
Sure. Well, we actually coined the phrase, the app generation. This was not something that we had in mind when we started our research.
Did you really? I had no idea, Howard. That's fabulous.
Well, keep using it.
Oh, that's fabulous. Okay.
And I was trained many years ago by David Reisman, a famous sociologist, who talked about American history in terms of what the populations at various times were directed at. In the 18th century, he called Americans the tradition-directed generation, because people did what happened in the old country. In the 19th century, when we went to the frontier and we sort of had thrown Europe off, he talked about being inner-directed. And in the 20th century, and many people remember this, he coined this phrase, other-directed. This was very much the time when Americans were moving to the suburbs and they were trying to keep up with the Joneses or the Kellys or whoever was next door. And when Katie and I were looking for the right way to characterize young people, basically tweens anywhere from 12 to 20, we said, this is the app generation. And apps are, as you know, shortcuts. They're convenient applications which one can activate and go very quickly to where one wants to go, either where one wants to go geographically or where one wants to go in terms of meals or in terms of psychology. And then, of course, you can activate the next app. And we saw increasingly that young people today think of whatever they want to do in terms of what apps are available. If there are no apps available and they can't create them, they push them aside. And then this was the kind of eerie aspect, Smoki, that often they think of their lives as a series of apps. First you've got to go to the right school, and then the right college, and take the right major, and the right internship, and then you should go to Wall Street or to Silicon Valley, but maybe go to Teach for America. And we call this the super app. And so we're really trying to characterize a whole generation. As you said, we're looking more specifically at three areas: how young people think of themselves, their identity, how they form a sense of who they are and where they fit in; intimacy, how they form relationships with other people, deep or superficial; and then, in many ways, the most surprising, what happens to their imagination, how creative they are when they live in an app-suffused world.
Well, there was a way that they labeled it according to the era, such as, the Great War, the Great Depression, the end of World War II. I mean, that's thought of that way. The Beat Generation. But now you point out that this is no longer going to happen. This is going to be, the generations are going to be judged by the technical and the digital. If you would walk us through that. I found that kind of frightening.
This is the first time since social scientists began to research this, literally a century ago, that young people themselves don't talk in terms of the war, the depression, or the Challenger explosion. They say, we are the Facebook generation, or the web generation, or the Tumblr generation, and I'm sure there are three new ones.
Since right now as we speak.
Yeah. So not only do they define themselves technologically, which we feel is unprecedented, but generations are much shorter. And one of the reasons they're much shorter is because if the older people are on MySpace, the younger people say, I don't want to be in MySpace, I want to be in Facebook. And as soon as the older people get to the Facebook
that
page,
happened, they said, my mother's on Facebook, my aunt I don't want to be on Facebook.
So then I want to tweet. And so we used to define ourselves in opposition to the personalities or to the agendas of older people.
So are you suggesting that it would now become the Facebook generation?
Well, good question. I think app is a broader term.
Okay.
I mean, if I take out my phone, I've got many different applications I can use. So it's an effort to be somewhat broader, and we could call it a digital generation, but everybody already, that wouldn't get anybody's attention. I mean, let me mention one of the interesting things about apps, which I didn't really realize. That in addition to being very swift and shortcutty and very structured, apps all have an icon. They have an instantly recognized brand, whether it's the Amazon shopping cart or the Tumblr little bird or the Facebook F. And not only...
They're not fooling around with words, they just give you this,
right, yeah. And not only does that mean these are instantly recognizable wherever they are, and if we go to a conference and we see a little Twitter, we know that Twitter, you're supposed to tweet, and maybe Twitter sponsored it, but also, and this is somewhat eerie, young people think that they have to brand themselves. And that's what's happening, we argue, on social networks.
So that's the end result of all this.
Well, I wouldn't say everybody does it, but when you see everything coming off very clear and polished and so on, you really don't want to we don't want to present yourself as being too spread out and too uncertain. And so we think there's often a premature push to identity, to making yourself clearer and more perfect than you really are. And that's in part because young people spend a lot of time surfing the social media, and seeing how other people present themselves. And nobody says I'm a big fat slob or I'm a liar. They talk about the wonderful times they've had, the great parties, the good drinks.
But there is a lot of lying going on.
Right, but when you're 13 or 14, you don't have a lie detector on. You have a, my God, I'm not having as good time as they are. I better. And there's some evidence that if you spend a lot of time on the social media, you don't feel better about yourself. You actually feel less adequate.
That would be very understandable to me. But tell us, you mentioned The Lonely Crowd by Reisman as being indicative. Walk us through that, why you felt that was such an important book. It was written some time ago.
Well, I read it some time ago,
yes,
too.
No, I did too. I was delighted to see it, recognized.
Well, we had an interesting thing going on. I wrote the book when I was in my late 60s. Katie Davis, my co-author, was half my age. Her sister Molly was half her age, and my grandson Oscar was half their age. So there was actually
so you're feeding information to all these generations.
There were four generations, and the reason that we found Reisman so powerful is he said something about people in mid-century America when you and I were there, but very young, that actually captured something that nobody else had, namely the extent to which people were no longer looking in themselves or looking to their grandparents, but trying to keep up with the Joneses. So they were looking left and right. Part of what I'm arguing here, and this is obviously true literally as metaphorically, people are now spending all their time looking here.
Oh, yes.
And what does it mean if as soon as you finish one app, you activate the other one? So the important educational distinction we make in the book is whether people are app-enabled or app-dependent. If you use the applications to get efficiently, let's say, to the North End from Beacon Street, and then you look around and you try different stores, you talk to people, you maybe
you're interacting with society.
But if as soon as you get there, you pull out your machine again and look at the next thing to do, or you never go to any restaurant which doesn't have the right number of stars, then you're app dependent. That's bad.
That's interesting. You go to the restaurant that has the most amount of stars. Not that you've discussed it as we would do, and I'm a generation ahead of you. I would discuss it with my friends before I went there.
Yeah, and of course it actually is very applicable to books, since we're talking about books here. Amazon and other book purveyors try to tell you what your interest is going to be. And I find their batting average is not bad, but on the other hand, serendipity. One ought to be able to walk into a bookstore or a library and pick up
have
stuff.
The whole experience, but also having the experience of going in there and finding other books.
Yeah. And so this is where pedagogy becomes important. Not just what teachers do in school, but what we do as parents and relatives and so on. Do we model app dependence where we're continuously making all decisions based on some application that somebody who wants to make money...
Something bad has to come out of that.
Well, I think what Katie and I would say is it's really in our hands whether we use the apps limited ways and continue using our minds.
Such as you say, going to the North End, finding the restaurant, and then walking around and getting the human experience of seeing other people looking into the stores rather than going back to your app again and seeing the 5 stars.
But if you get into a habit from age 2, and we know that kids are locked into their
Yes.
devices from age 2, of always looking there, then the chance that you're going to free up your neural networks is reduced. And that's why I think almost everybody who thinks a lot about this thinks that we ought to be able to put our devices aside sometime. So one of the fun things we did in the book, Smoki, is we brought together focus groups of teachers, of religious leaders, of therapists. I actually interviewed in a focus group 14 psychoanalysts in New York. We brought together camp directors, and they had to be people who had worked with kids for at least 20 years, and we said to them, you know, how are kids different now? And they said, in our camp, we have a burial ceremony at the beginning of the year, and we ask kids to bury their smartphone till the end of the summer. And kids do that, but many parents give the kids an extra phone which they hide inside their teddy bear. That's not modeling app enablement, that's modeling app dependence.
Well, before we go, I want to have you quote the person that asked you that incredible student, that incredible question you cited, that in fact, where were we going? So this is about why do we need.
Yes, I got into a lot of trouble
That
for this,
I found-
Smoki,
oh,
but
I
I
thought-
love that I got
Yeah.
in trouble. About 2 years ago, a young man, bright young man, comes up to me and says, Professor Gardner, why do we need to go to school when the answer to all questions are contained in this device?
I found that such a disgusting question, I have to
Well,
tell
he
you.
was a kid. I looked at him, I said,
Okay.
yes, the answer to all questions except the important ones. And as a teacher and educator, I'm glad people have information, but I want them to think about the
Yes,
difficult
yes.
questions of war and love and the future where you can't look it up. And part of the sad part of the app generation is a lot of them feel if you can't look it up, it's not important.
That is pretty frightening, it really is. But what is the good news?
The good news is that, as we say in the book, civilization does depend upon automating things. I mean, you know, if we didn't have vehicles that get us place quickly and machines that give us the news quickly, you know, life would be much more demanding. But if we're freed, we should free our minds, our bodies, our spirits, our imaginations to go in places where nobody's been before. I love to use Steve Jobs as an example because Steve Jobs has as much responsibility for apps as anybody in the world.
Yes.
And yet he's the last person in the world who ever would have let his own decisions be determined by
Be
what somebody
mired
else
down
has.
by a little
Right.
cell telephone. Well, I hear that's good news. We've been talking to Howard Gardner, professor of cognition, the Harvard School of Education, and also named by the magazine Foreign Policy as one of 100 most influential intellectuals in the world. Thank you so much for being our guest. It's been a delight.
Always good to see you, Smoki. Thank you.
Our guests today are David Jacobs and Janet Tracy. They're the co-publishers of The Current. It actually started off as the Back Bay Current and then expanded into the South End, Beacon Hill, and now it's downtown Boston. And it's growing and growing by leaps and bounds. I can hardly believe, David, it was 20 years ago. Time passes so quickly.
Oh, it does.
And
Totally.
interestingly enough, David started online. And then he quickly jumped right into print and decided he'd publish the newspaper. And it has been expanding and expanding ever since you took it over. But would you walk us through the history? I mean, those interested in journalism, the youngsters would be particularly interested in knowing the history. If you would tell us the history.
We started in September of 1995 because the Back Bay did not have its own neighborhood newspaper. And we felt, how can you really have a neighborhood unless there's an internal mechanism for communications? And honestly, we have been growing because we give our reader the sort of news where they cannot get anywhere else. And I would say a large part of our growth is the fact that we do not have a website. We have not seen any successful business model for a newspaper having a website.
Well, now, David, one of the things that you are reading about you explained, and many people hold this feeling, that indeed if you're going to publish it, you go on a website, it's not going to bear out your expenses at all. The money will just flow in, but it will not flow back at you. And you found this up very quickly, didn't you?
Very, very quickly. I can tell you that I read every newspaper, the dailies and the weeklies online. Bottom line there is I do not see the print advertising. Basically, people are giving away their product for free, and you can't stay in business very long that way.
Because it doesn't cover the expenses.
Not at all.
So you quickly went from online to publishing. Tell us about your first hurdles that you had to jump when you started. You must have had things that you did not expect. You had not been in the publishing business. You were somewhat of an innocent getting into the publishing business. You would walk through that.
No, actually, I started my first newspaper in 8th grade at the President's School out in West Newton High School, chairman of the board of my college daily paper. While I was getting my MBA at Columbia, I somehow ended up doing a little teaching at their graduate school of journalism.
All I'm saying is that indeed you didn't have to raise the money for the President of Columbia. You were getting into something where you actually had to, bear out your expenses with writers, with publishing, paper, and advertising.
That's true, and I think the biggest surprise is the fact that by our third issue we weren't making money, but we were cash neutral.
But you did see a steady flow of the money coming in, is that correct?
Yes, and that's primarily because we found a coterie of advertisers who understood the value of having a local newspaper.
And you were backed up pretty much with the writers. One of the things that I found interesting in talking to you is that you don't have any problem. You have some marvelous writers, finding writers for your newspaper.
On one level, it takes us literally 3, 4, 6 months to find just the right people. And particularly...
The quality, you say, is terrific.
Oh, it's outstanding. What we do is we find people not quite out of college, who like at least a year, a couple of years of actual experience, and then they come into what we call our boot camp, where every article in the Courant is read by at least 4, sometimes 5 sets of eyes.
Reviewing it, really.
Yes, and
your articles are just terrific. Terrific. They are in depth in many areas. I want to go to Jen now. Jen is all over the place. I think of David as being the business person, but you explain to us what you do.
Well, that's an interesting question, Smoki. I do a little bit of everything. I edit the paper, I help with strategic planning, I help with lining up stories, I take photos for the paper, I help put out fires in times of crisis.
Jen, I see you as a one-to-one person. You are more one-to-one than the other. Maybe it isn't more practical. Usually the newspaper very I know you are too, but you are pretty much more on the public, aren't you, right?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Yes.
And what have you found? What have been some of the unusual photographs that you take? Have you run into, because I know that having dabbled in it a bit, you run into funny situations. Tell us.
Oh, I've run into, it's amazing some of the situations I've run into. I've run into what I thought were happily married couples, and I see them fighting. And then I hope that maybe I could bring up a little bit of light on that moment for them, so I ask them to smile for me for a cute photo. So they do it, and then I walk off. Sometimes I see people that you wouldn't expect maybe drink a little too much. Sometimes I see a woman yelling at her child. But for the most part, what I see are very, very positive things. I see the enthusiasm at the South End Youth Baseball League when our team wins the game. A few years ago, they won the World Series, and I just was so thrilled. I saw the parents, I saw the children, the coaches, and of course, that made me feel wonderful.
Have you ever thought of possibly you could write little vignettes? Because I see you all over the city, having experienced all kinds of different
I could, and I have some thoughts maybe going forward that I might do that if I could ever find that moment to put it into print.
You should be making notes when these things happen.
Oh, I
You don't have to
do.
be in depth, but just quick notes if you listen to the memory coming back to what happened.
I do that. As a matter of fact, over the weekend, I was organizing my old photographs, and I thought, I don't remember David with an umbrella twirling around in the middle of Park Square in pouring rain, thinking that he was Gene Kelly.
That sounds like a keeper.
It is a keeper. I don't remember David sliding on the ice down Beacon Hill, sort of using the snowplow with his feet. There's a sheet of ice one day. So, and I see a lot of other interesting things.
Politically and socially. Let me ask David. David, you have been adding reports, haven't you?
Oh, yes.
Tell us about it.
With growth, we have more neighborhoods to cover. In fact, I think we'd be growing even faster, but finding just the right reporters who fit into our corporate culture.
Are you the real estate expert, or do you have somebody else that comes in? Because you have a central section that is very important in real estate.
Oh yes, the bottom line is in the Boston Current, Jen is the creative genius. She will come to me with ideas. I will say, no, it doesn't make any sense. We will try them I will try them in order to stay happily married, and they tend to end up being the most popular sections of the newspaper.
But it works out both of you, because I do think if you were being very business oriented, and we women have a tendency to kind of, fluctuate, what have you. I don't see you fluctuate. I see you making very hard decisions that have to be made. You've expanded, you've gone from kind of a tiny little office. I understand your new office is quite lovely.
We've actually become the third largest circulation newspaper in the entire city of Boston.
Have you really?
Yes, we have.
Oh,
after the Globe and the Herald.
Well, it is, I have to say, this has been David Jacobs and Jen Tracy. And in a field where you see newspapers, diminishing, it's really very depressing. You look at the current, and the current is going against all these odds. And it's attributed to David Jacobs on my left, Jen Tracy on my right. They've come together as a couple. They were super exciting, marvelous business. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Smoki,
It's been
thank you.
terrific. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you for joining us tonight. This has been the Smoki Bacon and Dick Concannon Show.